Hi, I'm Heather Robertson and welcome to my studio. At Katy Designs, we're often asked many questions about how to use air dry clay with the Katy Designs molds. In this series of short videos, I'm going to try and answer some of our most frequently asked questions. First one being, what is air dry clay? Air dry clay is a water-based clay that dries when exposed to air without the need for an oven or a kiln to bake or cure your piece. I'll be using Hearty Soft air dry clay, but other air dry clays can also be used with the Katy Designs molds. Is it safe to use, and how light is it? Hearty Soft clay is a non-toxic, lightweight and slightly flexible paper-based clay which won't add any excess weight to your card or mixed media projects when dry. For example, if I take these three little butterflies, which were made with our Elegant Butterflies mold, pop those onto the scale, that's only 0.0425 ounces, which is only just over 1 gram for those three little butterflies. So that's not going to add any significant weight to your cards or craft projects. As another example, if I take this piece here, which is quite a deep mold, if this was cast in resin or plaster or concrete, this would be quite hefty in weight. But if I pop that onto the scale, it's not even 10 grams, 9.1 grams. So this is perfect for all your cards and mixed media projects. Another question we often get asked is, do we need to condition air dry clay? One of the things I love about using air dry clay is that you don't need to condition it. However, when you first get it out of the packet, it might be a little on the wet and the stretchy side. Now this would be too wet and sticky to go into your molds. So what I normally do is just roll it up, flatten a small piece out, and place that to one side for a few minutes or 10 minutes, depending on how warm your room is. And this will let some of the excess moisture evaporate off the clay. Then you're going to be left with a silky smooth, really soft clay, which will remove and release beautifully from your molds. Does the Hearty air dry clay come in different colours? The Hearty air dry clay comes in a variety of colours, and here are just a few of them. Later in this video series, I'll take you through the various ways that you can colour your Hearty Soft white to get the desired colour you need for your specific project. Once I've opened my packet of air dry clay, how do I store it? Once you've finished using your clay, you're going to want to make sure that you wrap this up and seal it really well to ensure that no air gets inside. It's an air dry product, so by its very nature, if air gets inside, it's going to dry up. So for the colours, what I like to do is really press that clay down deep inside the packet, not too much because you don't want to burst the seam here, but just press the clay into the packet so that you can fold the packet back in on itself. What I also like to do before I seal it is just give it a quick spritz of water on the inside, seal the packet, fold it in on itself like that, fold it back, and then I take a nice big piece of tape, I've already got a piece here that I cut earlier, and seal my packet. I'm just going to have a little handy flap there so I can lift that up easily when I next need it. And then I'm going to place this inside a plastic bag. You can also place a damp tea towel or damp baby wipe, something like that, inside the bag as well, just to keep some of the moisture inside this bag. Seal that up really well, making sure all the air is out of there, and then pop this into an airtight container. Now what I've also done is I've got a nice big bag like this, and all my sealed bags are in there, and I just place this inside, wrap that up tight, and pop that inside my box. So I'm going to do the same thing with my Hearty Soft white. I'm going to fold the packet in on itself, make sure that's all tucked down, tucked inside there like that. Fold it back on itself like that. Take some tape, seal my packet, And then that I will put into another plastic bag, or if you've got any leftover bags from your Hearty Soft White, because these are foil lined, they really keep the air out and the moisture in. And I sometimes double bag, so the area that's open, just push that inside there, and then you have a double seal on your Hearty Soft White, so that's going to keep your white nice and fresh. Now, when I've got small individual colours, so these are ones that I've mixed up, I've got quite a bit here. I'll pop these into little sandwich bags or little snack bags. I'm going to spritz some water inside the bag just to keep it nice and fresh. And I'm going to take a wet towel or baby wipe, pop that inside as well. Fold it up, making sure all the air is out of the bag. Let's seal that bag up. Squeeze it, make sure all the air is out. It's a nice tight seal. You can do the same with this one. I'm just going to spray water in this one without baby wipe. Seal the bag, make sure all the air is out. Nice squeeze. Take another plastic bag. I always double bag my clay because I want to make sure that I'm not going to have any air inside. And I've been using this clay for a long time. I just keep adding to it. Pop that inside your airtight container. Pop the lid on. And then store that in, I would store that on the shelf, store it anywhere not too warm because you don't want the air to evaporate. But there you have it. Your clay is nicely stored away and ready for next time. There are many ways to colour your Hearty Soft clay, but we recommend using a like-for-like product. Hearty make a range of colours in a clay form which are highly, highly pigmented. And when used together with our measuring mould, you can mix vibrant colours exactly the same every single time, so you never run out of the colour you need. For example, if I just take a number 6 here, mix that in with my white, then we should have exactly the same colour as we have over here for number 6. And you get beautiful, beautiful, vibrant colours with a very, very small amount of coloured clay. So let's roll that into a ball. And there you see, we have exactly the same colour every single time. Now let's take a look at using paint to colour our Hearty Soft clay. You can also use gouache, watercolour or acrylic paints to colour your Hearty Soft clay, but bear in mind that this may change the consistency of the clay and make it a lot wetter, so you may need to leave the clay to dry a little bit before using it. Also, the colours aren't as highly pigmented, so you're not going to get those bright tones as you will with a like-for-like product without adding too much of the paint and making it too wet and sticky. So if I blend these two together, that was a similar amount of paint as I used for the clay, I think. But as you can see, the colours aren't as bright in tone. You need a lot of paint to get it up to that level of pigmentation. Did you know that you could also use ink pads? Let's take a look. Your distress inks and oxides and other ink pads are another fun way of colouring your clay. Again, you're not going to get the level of pigmentation that you will with the Hearty Soft clay. However, you can keep building that tone and build it up to the level that you want it to be. However, it can be a little bit on the messy side. As you can see, I'm getting ink all over my hands here. Just keep blending the ink into your clay. But again, this will change the consistency of your clay and make it quite wet and stringy. So you will need to leave this to dry for a little bit. Again, the colour pigment is not as bright as with the Hearty Soft clay or the Hearty colours. You can also use alcohol inks to colour your Hearty Soft clay. Again, be careful with the amount that you use. This can be very messy, and a little bit does go a long way. But again, it's a messy process, and the consistency of your clay may change depending on how much of the ink you place into your clay. And again, you're not going to get those bright, vibrant colours as you do with the Hearty colours of clay. So there again, so that's with alcohol ink. And you can also use your marker pens. You can also use your marker pens and watercolour markers to colour your clay, but you will need quite a lot of your marker pen to get that colour into your clay. But you can gradually build up the colour this way. So again, just keep drawing on the clay with your marker and just blend the colours in together. So you can get some really soft pastel tones when using your watercolour or even your ink markers, acrylic ink markers. But as you can see, I'm having to constantly keep applying the colour to make sure that that pigment goes into the clay, because you're only adding a tiny bit at a time. Now, if you're only wanting really soft pastel colours, that is a good way to go. But again, you're not going to get the same range that you will using the hearty colours when mixing that with the hearty soft clay. So, as you can see, there are many ways to colour your hearty soft clay, but for best results, we do recommend using the hearty range of colours. It's less messy and you're going to get a much, much bigger range of tones that you can mix. The Katy Sue Designs moulds release beautifully every time, but here are a couple of extra tips to help you get the most out of your new mould. When you first get your mould, condition it with some corn flour. Just use a paintbrush or a makeup brush to get the powder deep inside the mould. This will help remove any excess moisture from your mould and help with easy release. Then take your clay and press this firmly inside your mould, and using a rocking action, move the clay from the bottom to the top of the mould and away from the edges. This will help you get a nice crisp line and help remove the clay from the mould beautifully. Work the clay up the mould and remove any excess clay with the side of your thumb. If you haven't used enough clay, just pop some more clay into the mould and do the same thing. Using a rocking action, push and press the clay into the mould and then pull the clay away from the edges. Then give your mould a flex. This will help get the air underneath the mould and help release your cast. And there you have your first cast. You may also find it helpful to use a little bit of white vegetable fat or lip balm if you're just using this for craft. This can also help to release your clay from the mould. Just use a little bit of that, press your clay inside the mould, use the same rocking and pushing action to press your clay into the mould, adding any extra clay in those areas that may need it. Pull this away from the edges. And it's also advisable to only cast one piece at a time. Reason is, when you go to flex your mould, you don't have to be careful about where you're placing your other thumb. Give the mould a flex and release the cast from the mould. And there you have it. Here are some of my tips on using our border moulds. When using a continuous border mould, I find the easiest thing to do is roll a long snake of clay about the width of the area of the mould that you're going to use. Turn the mould sideways, so you're going to be working from bottom to top, and then place your clay in the mould and gently work your way using a rocking action so that you're pressing the clay into the mould and pulling it away from the edges, and work your way from one end of the mould to the other. Then when you get to the end, gently lift this up, slot that back into the mould, and this will fit in just nicely because it's a continuous mould, and then continue to work your way from one end all the way to the next. Now, if you don't have enough clay and you find that your snake has just ended and you need to add more, that's not a problem. Just add some more clay back into the mould and keep working your way up. Don't forget to pull that away from the edges so you have a nice crisp line. There we go. Then gently lift this out the mould and you have a perfect border every single time. We have a lovely selection of texture molds. Here are some of the ways that I like to use them. Here we have two different types of texture molds. I've got a standard texture and a continuous texture mold. Now, what I mean by continuous is the left and right and top and bottom sides match up together and you have a nice little puzzle piece that you can perfectly slot together and match up for your craft projects. But you use these molds in pretty much the same way. So I'm going to start off with a continuous mold, and I've flattened my clay out just with my fingers. Don't need a roller for this. And I'm going to place this into my mold. So it's only about the same width as my mold. I'm going to start with the bottom edge and slowly and carefully press and pull and smear the clay into that bottom edge. But I'm not pressing anywhere else on the mold just yet. The clay's just sitting there. So just press and push the clay and manipulate it into that bottom edge so that we have a nice crisp line on the bottom so that the top and bottom line up perfectly. There we go. And now I'm going to work my way slowly up the mold with my fingers, just pressing and pushing the clay. This will thin out the clay and also get that perfect image on the back. I don't recommend you use a roller for this because this will distort the image on the underside. You want to have the pressure going down as well as working the clay up the mold. So I'm still pulling it away from the edges on the side so that we have a nice crisp line. Keep working my way up and keep working your way up by pressing your fingers all the way up the mold, and then you can remove any excess clay. Then keep working your way up and pull away the excess. So just take your time with this, enjoy the process. You can add more clay back in if you've removed some, if you've removed too much. Just being careful not to pull the clay back down. So I'm just using the edge of my thumb just to pull the clay away. I felt that area was a bit thin, so I'm going to add some more clay back there. Pull that away from the edge so you've got those nice crisp lines. Press that down with the palm of your hand. You can also turn the mould over. Press that down on your work surface. And then roll the mould up your board, and there you have a perfect pattern every single time. Here's another fun way of using a texture mould to add some texture to your craft projects. Here I've wrapped a tin with some air dry clay, and I'm going to use this as a bit of a stamp and press my tin onto the mould and get that lovely brick texture coming through. And you can do this all the way around your mould or all the way around your can and get that lovely texture. And here are some tips on using our deeper moulds. When working with really deep moulds, like our Green Man mould here, where you've got really deep areas and really shallow areas, you want to make sure that you're going to still get all this detail and have the mould release easily. So it's very important to make sure that you condition the mould really well with some corn flour, and make sure you tap out any excess powder from the mould, like that, so nothing is left inside the mould. Then make a point with your clay and press that into that deepest area. This will make sure that there are no air pockets in that deepest area. And then press your clay into the mould and work your way around the edges, making sure those edges are nice and crisp. So I'm pushing it into the edge and pulling it away from the edge. Pushing it in, pulling it away. pull off any excess. You can place it back in the middle if you want to, or pop it back in your packet. All right, that's nice and firm in the mould. I'm going to turn my mould over just to flatten the back by pressing that on the surface. And now I'm going to go around my mould and give this a wiggle all the way round. If there's an area that's sticking, you can support it with your thumb and just gently stretch the mould. Don't bend the mould and press in the middle there because you may squash the nose. You just want to get the air underneath to help it release. Turn the mould over, give it a wiggle, and your green man will pop out, or your deep character will pop out perfectly. And here are some tips on using some of our shallower moulds. When working with shallow moulds like this that have quite a large flat surface area, it can be helpful to use just a little bit of white fat or lip balm in your mould, and this will help hold the clay in place as you're casting your piece. Take your clay, roll that into the approximate shape of your mould, and start pressing this into your mould. Now, if your clay does start to stick to your fingers and lift out of the mould, it could be that your clay is still a little bit on the damp side. So remove your clay, set it to one side for a few minutes just to let some of that excess moisture evaporate, and then you can try again. So there's your leaf cast. Let's try this with the flower as well. So I'm going to roll this into a flat shape. Push that into the bottom two petals. Now there will still be some movement and some lift, but it won't be lifting as much as it would be without the help of your white fat. And then just press and push, pull off any excess, and then pull the clay away from the edges. Press that into your mould. And release. And there you have a beautiful thin flower and delicate leaf. Two-part moulds are a lot of fun, and this is how I get the best results. Two-part moulds, like our pinecone mould, can be a lot of fun and add extra depth and dimension to your craft projects. You could choose to make them a half pinecone like that to stick on flat surfaces, or choose to put them back to back and make 3D pine cones. Now, to do this, I would recommend doing both pieces at the same time, one after the other, to make sure that they match up perfectly. Now, this piece on the top was made a lot earlier and has dried out, whereas the piece on the bottom is still drying, and you can see that there's a slight size difference between the two. So if you want those to match up, make these two at the same time. Now I'm going to show you how to make one with a toothpick on the inside so that we can embed this into something like this one here. So I'm placing my clay into the mould, releasing the excess. Make sure I've got all that nicely to the edges. Pull that away from the edges beautifully. There we go. And I'm going to add just a little bit of PVA glue all the way round. If you want to, you could use a paintbrush for this. Depending on how wet your clay is, you may not need to use glue. I prefer to use glue because I know that my pine cone will stay together. Place my toothpick on the inside. Gently press my other piece of the pine cone on top. Give the mould a flex and gently lift it out. Now, if you're wanting, as the clay is wet, if you're wanting to add any detail on the sides here, you can emphasize those edges and join those two pieces up on the side like that, and the glue will help this to stick together. And then place that to one side to dry, and there you have your three-dimensional pine cones. This is how I get the best results when moulding or casting thin and delicate areas. When using shallow and intricate moulds, like our sitting reindeer here, it's important that your clay is not too wet and sticky. However, you still want it to have some stretch because you want to be able to get it into these intricate areas and delicate areas here, like the antlers. But I also want to give my mould just a little bit of extra help to help the clay stick and to help it release. So you could either use some white vegetable fat like Trex or Crisco, or if you're just using it for craft projects, you could use a little bit of lip balm. I'm not using very much, you just need the tiniest amount, and I'm going to smear that all over the mould. This will help the clay to stick and stay in these areas, so it's not going to slide around being so shallow, but will also help the clay release from the mould easily. You really don't need very much though. And I'm going to take my clay, turn my mould on its side like I normally do, and I'm starting from the deepest area of my mould and slowly working my way round the rest of the mould, just pushing the clay. So let's just make sure that that's in nicely. And again, around the head. So this area is fine. Now, when it comes to the antlers and this fine detail, I'm going to smear the clay as if this was icing or butter, and I'm really pressing it down into the antlers, into those thin details, and pulling off any excess clay as I go. There we go, just keep pulling off the clay, and then using a circular motion, I'm pushing and pulling the clay away from the edges, but pushing it into the mould at the same time. And I'm working the clay around to some of this deeper area here where I've got a bit more control. So just keep pressing that clay in. So none of these areas are super thin. Then work my way up, pull the excess away from the nose there. A little bit there from the antler. Make sure it's nice and neatly away from all these edges. Now, when it comes to releasing this from the mould, I'm going to give my mould a flex. You can see it's releasing easily already. It just wants to pop out. And I'm going to start by removing the thickest piece first. And then I'm gently supporting the head with my finger, and I'm stretching the mould open a little bit, giving it that wiggle, and I'm gently lifting the antlers out the mould. And then you can manipulate and place those antlers any way that you like. There you have it. And this is how I like to use different coloured clays within the same mould. Using multiple colours of clay in the same mould can be a lot of fun and can cut down on a lot of your decorating time. Here are two ways that I like to do this. First, I'm going to take a tiny little bit of white fat or lip balm and rub this into my mould. This is to make sure that the clay for the pollen sticks where I want it to stick. So I'm going to start with this little sunflower. I'm going to make sure that I'm not overfilling that section. And I think I'm going to make the sunflower blue this time. And I'm going to roll out a piece of clay approximately the same size as that. And I'm going to just press down. I don't want to have too much clay in the mould because I don't want to distort that centerpiece. Give that a little flex, and out pops a two-tone flower. So I'll show you one more. Let's do this one here. So I'm going to take a little bit of white fat or lip balm, press that into the mould, just wipe off any excess, and we need to make sure that we don't overfill that section, otherwise it's going to squash and bleed out into the petals. So just press that down so that the white fat is helping the clay stay inside the mould. And I'm going to put a little more clay than I need here in this mould. And just pressing straight down, and then I'm working the clay around the outside, pulling off any excess so that I'm not distorting the shape of the pollen underneath. And then push all that clay away from the edge back into the centre. Give that little flex. and out pops your perfect little flower with two separate colours. Now there is another way of doing two parts, and I'll show you that next. When you want to add two separate colours to a mould like this, where you've got quite a straight edge and a definite line between the two colours, this is quite simple to colour with two colours. And I'm going to show you two separate ways. First one being, I'm just going to pop some green clay into the top of my succulent pot there. Just press that in all the way. Pull off any excess. There we go. And then I'm going to take a blunt palette knife and just cut across the top. Make sure it is a blunt knife, not anything sharp, because you don't want to cut your mould. And then go in with my second colour and press that in, pushing that up against that line. There we go. Give the mould a stretch and release that from the mould. So you have your two-piece, your two-tone there. The other way of doing it is to fill the entire mould with your green clay. So let's just press that in all the way. Making sure I'm getting all those juicy leaves. There we go. Let's pop a little bit more there. Now, I'm not too worried about whether or not I've filled it all the way there. That doesn't matter. I'm going to release this from the mould. Use my blunt palette knife. Cut that area off. Place that back into the mould. And it'll slot in just nicely. You may just need to press it back in a little bit. And then take my second colour. And then go back in. So those are the different ways that I like to do multiple colours in the same mould. Give that a wiggle. And there you have a two-tone succulent pot. Air dry clay dries really quickly, but the length of time it takes does depend on a number of factors. First of all, how thick or thin your cast is, how wet or dry your clay is to begin with, and the weather conditions, so how dry or humid or hot or cold your workspace is. This will all affect drying time. A thin piece like this flower here should be dry within the hour, or at least dry enough to paint. So you want to make sure all this lovely detail is not going to get smudged when you get your paintbrush on it. Just place that onto some paper towel to dry. You can also shape your piece and place this in a ring of toilet paper or tissue paper just to help shape your pieces as they dry. The paper towel will help to wick any moisture from the underside of your cast while the air dries the outside. And then just occasionally turn your piece over just to let the air and the paper towel do their work. Another tip to help dry your pieces faster is if you have a nice warm cupboard, you could pop these into the cupboard overnight and they'll dry a bit faster. We don't recommend using a heat gun to dry your pieces, as too much heat can change the way your clay behaves or make it a bit puffy. So airing cupboard is fine, warm room is fine. You could use a hairdryer, but because the clay is so light, you might end up blowing your pieces off the table. There you go. Does the clay shrink, or how much does the clay shrink when it dries? Air dry clay does shrink a little bit when dry, but the amount of shrinkage will depend on how wet or dry your clay was when you placed it into the mould in the first instance. So what we recommend is let your clay dry a little bit so the excess moisture evaporates. And you're only looking at about 5 or 6% shrinkage. So here you've got a piece in the mould. There's not very much difference there at all. And if I place these pieces side by side, you can see there's really not much noticeable difference there at all. Hearty soft clay is a paper-based clay, so when dry can be cut like paper and card. So for this frame, I'm going to cut out the centre. I've already started cutting some. I'm using a cutting mat and a nice sharp blade, and it cuts beautifully into my dried clay. And there I have a lovely crisp edge and a frame ready to go. You can also cut the clay with scissors. So I've got these pieces here. You can cut them with a knife. They cut beautifully, or you can cut some jagged lines into this and we can make this look like some distressed wood. Nice and easily. There you have it. Or if you wanted to, on a thicker piece like this, if you wanted to cut this succulent off this pot and change the pots around, nice flat sharp blade cuts straight all the way through, and then you can swap these plants around like that, or you could change the orientation of the pot and have the pot the other way round. Now that all your clay pieces are dry, let's have a look at which glues are best to use. To get the best results, we advise using a water-based PVA glue. So here I have a very thin school glue, which is very, very thin and fluid, a thicker tacky glue, and a heavy acrylic gel medium. This can add extra dimension and height to your pieces and hold your pieces down very quickly. We don't advise using a hot glue, as this can become brittle over time. And a PVA glue will soak into both your clay and your paper and give a lovely firm bond. And then for a three-dimensional piece like this, if you just use a little bit of your gel medium, you can get that height and dimension and the extra support behind your pieces with an instant hold. What paints and mediums can I use to decorate my dried pieces? Well, if you're using Hearty Soft Air Dry Clay, remember it's a paper-based product, so anything you use on paper, you can use on your cast pieces. I'm going to show a few of them here in a little more detail, starting with gilding waxes. Using gilding waxes on your cast pieces will quickly allow you to bring out all that gorgeous detail that you get from the Katy Sue Designs molds. So over here I have a piece that's been cast in dark clay. I'm going to protect my work surface and very quickly bring out all that beautiful detail and all that gilding that you get on our medium frame. A little bit goes a very, very long way. And there very quickly you have a beautiful frame that does not look like it's been made out of clay at all. Alternatively, if you have a piece where you've messed up the painting, this was a white piece, I messed up the painting, I've just covered that in black acrylic paint, and I can then go in with my gilding wax and very quickly bring this piece to life and make it look like an old piece of metal, and look at all that detail and how quick that was just with a little bit of gilding wax. And then you can pop those two pieces together and you have a finished piece. Marker pens are another simple way of adding a pop of colour to your casts. So you could use alcohol markers, chalk markers, or regular felt tip pens. They will all work. Here I'm just going to do a black outline on this flower, just bringing out all that lovely raised detail. You could also colour on the inside of this as well. Here we go. And very quickly and effectively, you have a beautiful stylized flower that really pops off the page. And you could do the same thing with some colored clay and a darker color marker. Just go over those raised edges and bring all that detail out really quickly and simply, adding that pop of color to all your cards and mixed media projects. There you go. I think my favourite way of painting my pieces is by using watercolour paints and gouache paints, or a combination of the two. I love watercolours because they are so translucent and the colour flows beautifully into the moulds. Whereas gouache paint, although it works the same way as watercolour, is opaque, so you can layer the colours on top of one another. So using a combination of the two works really, really well. So what I mean by translucency, you can see with this piece here, the clay itself is a peachy colour, and we've painted over the piece, but you can still see the colour underneath and where the watercolour has gone into all those crevices, really bringing this piece to life. It almost glows. But you can also get this beautiful porcelain effect by using watercolours. So this has been painted on white. The watercolour has flowed beautifully into all those little crevices and gaps, and then we've just wiped away the excess paint with a damp cloth, and you get this beautiful bone china or porcelain effect. Let me show you how that's done just very, very quickly. So if I bring our autumn swag out here, you can see this piece has highlights. This piece is still solid colour. And I've started painting this piece, and this is what I mean by how the colours flow beautifully into the mould or into the crevices. So I've just taken some watered down watercolour here, and you can see how it just flows. And that's only 2 brush strokes there, and there you have it again. And it just flows into all those crevices. So you can paint something really intricate very, very quickly with the watercolour paint, and the colour of the clay is still shining through. Now when that's dry, if you take a damp towel or a baby wipe or a damp cloth and then just wipe away the excess paint, just the paint that's on the surface, don't forget to just turn your towel each time you wipe, then you're going to pick up all that paint that's on your rag there, and you're left with this lovely bone china effect. Beautiful highlights. Absolutely love this effect. So if I go back to this piece here, I'm going to take the paint off here, and you can see instantly how this piece comes to life just by removing that excess paint. Isn't that lovely? Really, really simple. Now, when you're using gouache paint, the lovely joy of that is you can paint this on top of a coloured piece. So I'm going to just take some watered down blue gouache, and it flows beautifully like watercolour as well. So it's much, much thinner than acrylic paint, but it still has the fluidity of watercolour, which I absolutely love. And look at that. You can get beautifully opaque colour with very, very little effort. So yeah, or use a combination of the two, like on this bird here, where most of this is watercolour, and then I've gone in and used white gouache in those white areas there. Acrylic paint is great for adding a bold colour statement to your pieces, and the colours can be layered up one on top of the other and blended together, but they can also be used for highlighting and adding shadow. So if I take a little bit of white paint and rub off any excess on some paper towel, I can bring out all this lovely detail in the moulds really quickly and simply. Or if I wanted to add some shadow in these shadow areas, I can just take a darker colour and do the same thing. And if I want to add a bit more highlight to this piece here, I can just brush my brush over there. And there you have it. Quick and simple and bold statements. Chalk pastels, eyeshadows, and even your ink pads. These are another simple way of adding a spot of colour to your cast and finished pieces. So I'm going to take, let's move my ink pads out the way, I'm going to take a little bit of pink eyeshadow here, or you could use chalk pastel for this, and I'm just going to brush this onto my flower just for a hint of colour. And you can layer this up and keep adding colour, and then just dust over the surface, and you can see how I'm picking up all that beautiful detail on the flower petals. And if you've got too much on there, just wipe a little bit away with a damp towel. And there you have some subtle colour on your flowers or on your cast pieces. Now I can do the same thing with an ink pad and a paintbrush, and you can choose how much ink you want to apply. So just gently brush that on to your flower. I'm just doing it in all those detailed areas, all those crevices, and this just gives a lovely subtle pop of colour to your pieces. And again, if there's any excess that you don't want there, just wipe this away with a damp towel. It is important though, when you're decorating your pieces, to make sure that your pieces are dry before adding any colour mediums to it. Let's have a look at what you can use to seal and varnish your finished piece. There are many varnishes and sealers out there that are compatible with the Hearty Soft air dry clay, and here are a few of my favourites. When I'm varnishing or sealing things such as eyeshadow and chalk pastels, or watercolour paints and watercolour markers, I tend to use a spray varnish because this is not going to shift the colour underneath. So this could be an art grade product, or it could be something as simple as hairspray. You can use brush-on varnishes with your alcohol inks and your acrylic paints, because these, once they're dry, they're not going to budge. So you can use brush-on varnishes for those. Even if you have sealed and varnished your piece, please remember that Hearty Soft air dry clay is a paper-based clay, so it's not suitable for outdoors. It's best to keep your pieces indoors or under cover, protected from the elements. It's important to keep your clay covered while you're working, but sometimes you'll find that your clay is starting to dry out while you're working with it. Now, there are a couple of methods I like to use to kind of put some life back into your clay. First one is, I've always got a bottle of water to hand, just a little spray bottle, and as I'm working, I can just give it a couple of spritzes every now and then, just a spritz, just until I can get it back to that workable consistency. It often doesn't need very much. Now, if I find that it's dried out a little bit, it's starting to get a little too stiff, I'll take a damp kitchen towel or a baby wipe and just wrap that around the clay, squeeze some life back into it, and that puts a lot more water back into it, more than you get with the spray bottle. So those are those two methods that I use. Another method is, if your clay is really stiff, just leave it to one side for a little while underneath a damp cloth, and this will, because the damp cloth is so damp, the water will have a chance to start soaking into your clay and get it back to a nice working consistency. So I'm going to leave that one for a bit longer. Another method is, I've got two pieces here, and I keep my clay in these little plastic bags. I'm just going to spray some water inside the bag, seal it back up, and then that moisture there is going to have a chance to kind of soak back into the clay. So that's another method. Another thing I like to do is, when it's a little too far gone, if you just take some of your clay and mix it with some fresh white clay, you can then get a workable consistency going again. The only downside with this is you do change the colour of your clay. So you're adding more white to it, so it will make your clay a lot paler. So that's another method. And the other thing I like to do is, so for my packets, if I find the edges are starting to just get a little bit on the crusty side, I'll pull some of those dry edges off, spray some water inside the packet, and then I'll put a damp baby wipe or wet towel inside there, seal it back up, and give that a chance for that water that you've sprayed in and the damp cloth to permeate through the clay, and that will help bring your clay back to life. This doesn't work on completely dried clay, but while the clay is starting to dry out, these tips will help. So we've had a look at how to revive clay that's starting to dry out, but what do you do with clay that's completely dry? Let's have a look. I love that nothing has to go to waste. So even, little bits of clay like this that have dried up and you think that you're going to have to throw away, you don't need to throw these away. And likewise with, say, this frame here, where I've cut out the centerpiece, this piece can still be really, really useful. And I've got some dried bits of brown here as well. I'm going to show you what you can do with these pieces of clay. I'm going to pop those to one side for now. So pieces like this, these make really, really handy foam pads. So if you're running out of your foam pads and you want pads in a specific size to bulk out or to raise up pieces of your card craft, just cut these into pieces with a knife or even a pair of scissors, and then just put a piece of glue on either side of these, and you're automatically raising up your piece and giving your work some three-dimensional look. So nothing has to go to waste. You can also do the same with these little bits here. Just cut them up and use them to backfill and raise your pieces up. You can also use them as a backfill. So break these pieces up, and for a deep mould like this, where I don't want to fill the entire mould with clay, I can pop some of these dried pieces in here just to use up, why put fresh clay in there when you can use up some of your dried clay, and then just put some fresh clay on top. Let's move that out of the way. There we go. Just put that fresh clay on top. Press that firmly down, and so that clay is not going to waste. You're still using that in a craft project. Release that from your mould, and no one would know that you'd backfilled that with dried clay. The other thing you can do is create a texture paste and create some soil to go into your air dry clay flower pots or your mixed media pieces where you want some soil or some extra texture. So the way I do this, let's move this little flower to one side. I'm going to take just a food grater and my dried clay and just grate your clay. And what you're going to be left with is a lovely, lovely fine paper clay powder. This isn't going to add any weight to your projects, and I call it my hearty clay soft soil. And you can create soil for your flower pots, or, as I said, make this into a texture paste. So just add a little bit of that into some glue and get a mixing knife or paint palette and just mix the glue into that. And there you have a spreadable texture paste that when dry, you'll be able to paint over that, and that can add some really fun dimension to your mixed media pieces. So don't throw your dry clay away, use it up. Okay, so we've had a look at what to do if your clay is starting to dry out too much or is completely dry, but what do we do if clay is too wet and if it's sticking in the mould? Let's have a look. So you have your mould and you've put your clay into your mould, you go to release it and you find that the clay is sticking inside your mould. Now there's a couple of reasons this could be happening. The most common reason is that your clay is just too wet. So what we recommend is flatten your clay and put this to one side for a few minutes just to let that excess moisture evaporate from the clay and make it less sticky. Now I'm going to clean this mould out a little bit before I move on to the next step. My clay was very wet and sticky. Okay. The other reason that your mould or your clay might be sticking to your mould is that you've got these deep areas here, but you've also got high levels of texture and detail here. So this is going to grip onto the clay and kind of hold the clay in the mould, which is what you need to get the detail, but you want it to release easily too. The other reason your clay might be sticking is if your clay is a little on the damp side, or you have a really smooth surface area like this, sometimes the clay will stick to this because there's a large surface area to stick to. So there are ways around this. I'm going to start with this mould first because this is the one that we've been working with. And I'm going to get some corn flour, just your standard kitchen grade corn flour. This is a really, really fine powder, and it acts as a lovely mould release. This just gets all the excess moisture out of the mould and creates a little bit of a barrier. So I'm really rubbing that in there. I'm opening up my mould slightly just to get my brush into those areas. I'm using a makeup brush. You could use a paintbrush for this. I'm going to put the powder to one side. Make sure you tap out any excess because you don't want the powder or corn flour to be stuck in any of those recesses there. The other thing that you could use is white fat, white vegetable fat, or lip balm if you're using this for craft. And this is really good over those high texture areas. So I'm going to use a paintbrush here and brush that in. You could also brush that into these deep areas here. You don't need much, only a tiny bit. This will just add as an extra release. I'm going to do the same thing on this mould here. So I'm going to put a bit of corn flour in the main area of my mould. Tap out any excess. But then I'm going to use a bit of my white fat or vegetable or lip balm on this surface area here. This will help the clay to stick to the area while I'm putting the clay in the mould, but help it to release easily too. Let's move those out the way. And I'm going to go in with some drier clay now. So this is a piece that I had out that was drying. And I'm going to press that into the mould. And in those deep areas, I'm going to press the clay into those deep areas because I want to make sure I get all that detail. And you can see this clay is a lot drier. It feels firmer. So not so much drier, but it's less stretchy. Pull off the excess and really press that clay into the mould, making sure you pull it away from the edges, which will also help with release. And now I'm going to give my mould a flex. So some of our moulds have this handhold all the way round, and don't be gentle. Give it a good firm flex, and this will get the air underneath. Then lift your piece from your mould, and there you have a lovely, beautiful cast with all that fine detail there, all that texture detail in there that we had from using the white fat and lip balm to help it release. So I'm going to place that to one side and do the same thing with this mould here. I've got some brown clay that I've had on the side drying out so it's not too wet. Press this into the mould. And on a large piece like this where you have a flat area and a high ridge like this, you can use another method to pull this from the mould. Let's just get all this clay in here, making sure you've got all those edges. We want to get all that lovely detail. Working my way from the bottom to the top, making sure the clay is pulled away from all those edges and pulling off any excess as I go. Let's flatten the back. Now I'm going to give my mould another flex all the way around, getting that air underneath. And now I'm going to use my countertop as a guide. So if you roll your clay up, you're going to get a much, much cleaner release. And there you have a beautiful three-dimensional frame. And lastly, let's have a look at what to do if your clay is stretching or distorting or tearing as you're removing it from the mould. one of the most asked questions we have is, how do you release the clay from a mould like this, where where we've got intricate areas? My clay keeps stretching and breaking as I'm trying to release it from the mould. As you can see here, as I'm stretching it, it's tearing there. And one of the main reasons for this is that your clay might be too wet. So what we recommend is, as with all our moulds, just flatten out your clay and let the air get to it. Let that excess moisture evaporate. But some of the other issue could be the way you're releasing it from the mould. Also, coming back to clay, I find that white clay, especially straight out the packet, is more stretchy than the coloured clay. So one of the tips I find is add a bit of the hearty colour to your white clay, and I find this firms up the clay a bit more, and I find it's much easier to release from the mould. You could also use a little bit of white fat or Trex or lip balm if you're using this for craft. I'm brushing it in with a paintbrush here, but you can also use your fingertips. This will help the clay to stick while you're pressing it into the mould, but will help the clay to release more easily too. I'm going to get the piece of brown that I've had on the side so it's not as sticky. So you can see it's breaking apart more easily. So this is not going to stretch so much when you put it into the mould. Press your clay into the mould, working from the thickest areas first. Then smear your clay into those fine areas. Now you can see your clay is not as stretchy as it would have been if it was straight out the packet. And then I'm using a rotating action to press the clay into the mould, into those recesses, but also pull it away from the edges and reveal those little islands, all those high areas. So because the clay is not going to be sticking on the outside, this will help release the clay more easily from the mould. But take your time with this as well. Don't rush it. With a delicate area like this, just take your time. Press the clay into the mould. Keep working your way around. Rotate the mould if you have to. And pull the clay away. Any excess, pull it away. And then you can push the clay back in. And it's important that if you've got an area that's very thin, add a bit more clay back into that area. So I'm taking my time with this, making sure it's away from the edge. Now this area here, where I found it was breaking a little bit earlier, I'm just going to add a little extra clay there, just to build that area up just a little bit. And I sometimes find that helps. If you've got an area that's where you find that it's breaking more often, just put a little bit of extra clay there. And then it's important you give your mould a flex, but be gentle around this area. So I find if you squeeze it and flex, squeeze and flex, what you find is you're releasing it from the edge and you're still getting that air underneath. Can you see that the antlers are starting to lift now? And find what works for you, whether it's removing the head first and then the antlers, or removing the antlers first and then the head. Find the method that works for you. Every single mould will be different, and it does depend on how dry your clay is. But I'm just being careful, working my way around so I can see that there's movement underneath. If you find it starts to tear there, I'm just going to add a little bit more clay in that area. Press that down. So I'm not worried about distorting the detail because the clay is still in the mould and I'm working my way around. Now I'm going to use my surface as a guide. And I'm going to pull the mould away from the clay, not the clay away from the mould. So then you're using your work surface as a support, and use your finger or a paintbrush to gently coax that fine detail out of the mould. There you go. And then carefully lift this up and place this onto some paper towel to dry.